Thanks very much. I want to just say, first of all, this is sort of a team effort. There are a lot of us at PPIC who have worked on this, and I want to most especially thank Karina Jacquet, who's here today. And as the audience size and familiar faces indicate, this is a pretty big topic in California, hugely important for the school children of the state and for a very large percentage of the school children who are actually English learners themselves or former English learners. Today I'm going to talk a bit about, give some background figures on demographics, outcomes, academic outcomes, and focus on just a few of the important policy considerations that are on the table right now. There are obviously many, many more things than we can discuss today, and maybe some of the favorite topics that don't come up during the talk can be part of what I'm sure will be a lively set of questions and conversations after the more formal portion of the talk. I also wanted to say, please, if there are questions of clarification, do ask as I go through. Happy to take those and don't want to have any unanswered, confusing slides staying up there. So with that, I'll start. English learners are a very big part of California's future. Right now, they're about 25% of the school children in our K through 12 public schools. That's about 1.4 million students altogether. And what I mean by English learners are those students who need additional support to be taught academic subjects in English. On average, English learners are lagging behind their native English-speaking peers in our schools. It's not all bad news. Some English learners are reclassified very quickly, and those I'm going to refer to sometimes as reclassified students or former English learners, or the acronym RFEP as we go through the talk today. Many English learners don't get reclassified quickly, and some stay longer, 5 or 6 or more years. Long-term English learners doesn't have an official definition, but we're generally thought of as ranging between 5 or 6 or more years. And for California's future, to prepare for the jobs of the future, to close achievement gaps for our students, graduating more reclassified students, and better prepared English learners among those that don't get redesignated, but if they're still English learners at the end, they still need to be better prepared. That's a crucial goal for our system, and it's really should be central to what we're doing with our students. So quickly, I'm going to go through some demographics, talk about academic outcomes, and a few of the important policy considerations that are on the table right now when we're trying to figure out how we can help this group. So first, some demographics. Most of the state's English learners speak Spanish at home, 85%, according to the most recently complete language census. And there are a number of other important groups that amount to more than 1% of the student population of English learners. Those are Vietnamese, Filipino, Cantonese, Hmong, and Korean speakers. Now there's something like 53 other languages in the other category. So altogether we have nearly 60 languages in K through 12 schools. So no doubt this is a large challenge for our educators. English learners live in all parts of the state. They are certainly more concentrated in urban areas, as is the state's population, but they're also in rural counties in the state. And some counties have have an overrepresentation relative to the state average, and those counties are Imperial, Monterey, Santa Barbara, Colusa, and Mono counties. This next slide, I think, is an important concept and one that's easily forgotten when we're trying to understand English learners. This is not a static group. This is a dynamic group. Students enter and exit the EL population every year. So when we talk about a reclassification statistic or anything that applies to ELs, keep in mind some of those ELs are brand new. Some students just left the EL population. So let me take you through a couple of ways in which this is important to think about when we're trying to describe English learners. Most English learners are US born. This first bullet is US data, but it's surely true in California as well on average. 82% of students, EL students in kindergarten through 5th grade are native born. When you get out to older grades, that falls to 55% of students. There are at least 2 reasons why this is happening. The US-born students who are starting by and large in kindergarten might be more likely to be reclassified quickly than foreign-born students whose parents are perhaps more likely to struggle more with English at home. So over time, the share of the foreign-born that makes up the EL population at older grades is higher. Another reason is we get new English learners every year in California schools. Some English learners are moving from abroad with their families and starting in any grade, going K through 12. So we see that, and here's an example of that in the next statistics, as we see, if we look at second graders, only 2% of English learners arrived within the last 12 months. When we get out to ninth grade, that goes up to 6%. So it's not as if we're getting floods of new English learners every single year, but they are increasing as a percentage of the population, of the student population that we're serving in the older grades. Some other ways to think about these grade level differences is, first of all, 1/3 of kindergartners are ELs. That's a smaller percentage over time across the grades. And another way in which the population is dynamic and important to think about from a policy perspective is that most of our secondary ELs are actually long-term learners. So while we're still getting foreign-born students added to the secondary school population, a lot of the English learners that are there have been there for a while. So it's an interesting mix of students that educators are dealing with in secondary schools. We're going to look at this in a little bit more detail. Now I'm showing you English learners in the blue bar, as well as former English learners or reclassified students or RFEPs in the orange bar. You can see that over time, the number of English learners in every grade, sorry, this is a snapshot. This isn't a longitudinal view. This is 1 year looking at different grades. But as the grades progress, you see that the numbers of English learners are actually lower for each grade. And once we get to starting in second grade, the number of reclassified students is growing larger. So there's a shift in the population of students as you progress through the grades in school. Two important things to note also are, first of all, there's not a lot of reclassification going on in kindergarten and first grade. These are estimates, so there may be some cases where that takes place, but by and large it doesn't. And some districts have explicit policies to preclude that. And most of the reclassification action, the grades in which more are added to this pool of reclassified students, that's happening more in third, fourth, and fifth grade than in the other grades. These data aren't perfectly suited to that kind of analysis, but it's kind of the best that we've got at a state level right now, at least in the public data. So, not a dynamic population. Each grade has a different mix of English learner and former English learners. And if we just focus on the English learner population, we kind of lose sight of the fact that a lot of our students used to be English learners, and they may have needs as well. Let's talk a little bit about some academic outcomes. First, we're going to start with some measures from elementary school. I'm looking here at the CST, the English Language Arts exam, for fourth graders over time. And this is the percentage of students who are scoring basic or above. You can see over time, everyone that we're talking about, all the student groups we're talking about here, are making improvements since 2003 going forward to 2011. Reclassified students are at the top of the heap with nearly 100% of them scoring at least basic or above. The English learner group is towards the bottom of the heap, making progress over time, but still a very large gap between English learners and reclassified students. And students who are English only, students who have never been a part of the English learner group, actually don't do as well as students who used to be English learners. Now let's move into high school. We're going to look at the high school exit exam, or the CASE. Here I'm looking just at 10th grade. Again, we're comparing the same kinds of students. We also have the student average here. And we're separating the English language arts and the math portion of the CASE. You need to pass both to pass the CASE, but I think it's especially instructive for English learners to see the two disaggregated. Again, English learners are at the bottom of the heap. Let's focus first on English language arts. Only 44% are passing the CASE when they take it in the 10th grade. English-only students are doing dramatically better, but RFEPs are again at the top of the heap. 94% pass the English language arts exam. When we look at math, we see the same rank order of who's doing well and who's not doing well, but it's compressed. You have a question?
Just the all students,
Uh-huh.
the English only, is that including special education students?
I believe this does not. That's a good question. Yeah.
When you say English only,
Uh-huh.
can you define English only?
So English-only students are students who never became either an English learner or a reclassified student. So when a student is new to California schools, their families are asked to fill out a home language survey. So if they never had to take the exam and never scored at either whatever the below thresholds were, and were never a reclassified student, then they're in this group.
So more specifically, students who are born here, third generation English parents, are they English only, or are you talking about, okay?
Yeah, they should be, unless they felt, if they're consciously trying to raise a bilingual child and answered that they speak a language at home, then they could. You know, you hear stories like that, but it's certainly not the majority of what we're talking about here. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. And please ask me to do that, because I've forgotten that not everyone can hear. The question was a little bit more specifically a definition of the English-only student. So a third-generation family, as long as they don't answer that they speak a language other than English at home, or any of those subsection questions on the home language exam, if those students are all English-only. Yes?
Hi, I was wondering, the slides you're reviewing right now are about reclassified students and performing a little better.
Uh-huh.
Overall, even English-only students. I was wondering if there's research differentiating between, are those students that reclassified earlier starting at a higher base, or are they, perhaps more likely to be native born? And then on the other side, do those benefits of having students that benefited from better English support programs, is that something that, could be applied also to English-only students?
These are great questions that I think there is some research on, and we have plans for more research on. I'll give you a little bit of a preview for that, but we're not going to have results about that today, or unfortunately for a few more months. But that doesn't mean that we can't talk about that later on. Okay, I'm going to move on to our next academic slide, academic outcomes. Here are English learner, we see here English learner dropout rates are quite high, especially compared to these other groups that we're able to disaggregate. 25% using this cohort measure dropped out, and that's compared to 18% of Latino students, 9% of white students, 6% of Asian students, and 25% of African American students. An important caveat here is that this measure, only here in these slides, but this measure of English learners includes English learners who became reclassified during high school. So if we could separate those out, English learners would actually have higher dropout rates here. So far, the story is pretty clear that reclassified students are doing well. They're doing better, on average, than all students together, and then students who are never in this English learner system at all. But here's where the story gets a little bit more complicated, and here's where we get into trying to answer the question that was just asked about, does it matter sort of when students are reclassified, or what the programs are, or any of those kinds of issues. This chart itself isn't going to answer those questions for us, but explains why we need to spend some time understanding the answers to those questions. Here now we're looking at, again, the CST. This time we're looking at it by grade, taking a snapshot in time. So we're not following students over time, but looking at different students in each of these bars. The first chart I showed you was basic or above. Now we're talking about proficient or above. So that's what you need for your AYP measure. It's a higher bar. And we can see some of the same patterns that we've been seeing in the previous three slides. English learners are not doing well in comparison to English-only students, nor in comparison to the reclassified students. And in fact, reclassified students do very well up until 5th grade, when you start to actually be almost the same as English-only students. 6th grade, and then by 7th grade, they're actually not doing as well as English-only students. So we need to understand, what is this about? Is this evidence that that reclassified students lose ground over time? Maybe. Is this evidence that this is a dynamic population and we can't just generalize from a snapshot like this? Is this going on because students who are reclassified at younger grades actually do quite well, but students who get reclassified at older grades and are entering the pool here in 8th, 9th, and 10th grade don't do as well, so they bring down the average. And we can't tell from these data, and if we can't tell from these data, it's hard for us to come up with the right policy prescriptions. Yeah?
So for example, in 8th grade, the reclassified number, does that include only 8th graders who were classified, or from K to 8?
So the scores here would include anyone who, standing in 8th grade, is reclassified, whether that was in kindergarten or 8th grade. Okay, so the other thing to note is fourth grade is the year that the CST kind of appears to be easiest for everyone. And students, when they get out to 11th grade, everyone's relative performance is falling. It's just that the reclassified students' performance has fallen relatively more. And in fact, they are now doing relatively worse compared to English-only students. So this is a complicated story. And we need to be able to understand it if we're going to figure out how we can help. So we need reclassification policies that are going to lead to long-term success. And because we've just seen reclassified students do better, it makes sense. Policymakers want to reclassify more ELs and they want to do it more quickly. But we need to know if these outcomes persist over time, because that will help us tweak the policy to make sure that we're doing the best for the most students. As it stands now, districts and schools really vary in the English learner programs that they deliver to students, and even if they have the same program name, they can vary really widely in the way that it's implemented. They can vary in the resources that they have to do this, and they can vary in the way that they have prepared teachers to help them with these things. So what the state has done is established minimum reclassification criteria. Districts are able to add to the criteria, and that's what determines if the student sort of makes the bar. And I think there are many other layers of interpretation that are also possible within districts and schools, and possibly even classrooms for when the student meets that district's minimum criteria. But we need to understand, will reclassified students do better if we now just lower the bar? We want to make more of them reclassified because reclassified students do better. But if we lower the bar, will those students at the margins actually perform? So this sounds like a great question for research. We want to use the variation across districts and time, because reclassification policies change over time, to understand the link between reclassification policies and academic outcomes. Question in the back.
But if you don't know when they're being reclassified, it could be if the districts who are making policies not to initially identify kindergartners as English fluent. And if they're waiting until third grade and they're using the CST scores, it could be that these students were reclassified because they were never meant to be English learners in the first place, because they had the full command of English.
Right. I think that's a really important issue. Oh, yeah, thank you. Okay, so this question gets to, is the identification mechanism in kindergarten working? Do we maybe have students who are English learners, who are labeled English learners, who might not belong? And that's going to kind of they might get stuck in the English learner system until they can get to the CST in third grade, when they can maybe test out. And I think that is an issue, and that's definitely something that policymakers have raised, and that kind of question is more easily answered with data where you can follow students over time, and you know how this individual student scored on their language literacy in their home language, because many districts have that data, as well as their first scores on the CELT and all that. So you can see that if we're able to look within districts, and that is something that PPIC is going to do with at least 2 districts in the state in the coming months. We're starting now. But yes, to really refine the policy, that it makes the most sense, I would argue, to get into district data and understand all the nuance. What the entry-level literacy was like, what the intervening year CELT scores were like, what course grades were looking like, all of those layers together. So in designing the appropriate reclassification policy, because the districts and schools, even within districts, may do things differently, it's really important to understand what's the pool of EL instruction and options that we're working with. So if districts are doing things differently in name, but not only in name only, but even in practical terms. For example, if one district is really implementing a program that is giving lots of support to the English learner student, but also maintaining the student's ability to have full access to academic content, then reclassifying that student quickly might not be as important as in a district where academic content is really not accessible to an English learner student. So these contextual things really are going to matter in designing the ideal reclassification policy. So important questions as we're kind of considering all these contextual issues is the minimum criteria that's that the state has right now enough? Are some districts waiting too long, even if the criteria are the right ones? And I meant to mention also the idea of some districts might be providing some post-reclassification support, or maybe we should be thinking about that in some districts where we're not. Another important policy consideration that's on the table right now is the Common Core state standards. These are sort of both, in some views, a threat and an opportunity. The new Common Core state standards might really add to challenges for English learner students because the academic content of the English content, rather, of all subject matters has been kicked up a notch. It's much more complex. So this isn't just an English learner issue, it's also an issue for all students who are struggling with academic English. And we can see from the charts we saw earlier, you know, plenty of students are not making the proficient cut when it comes to the ELA, and there are even, you know, 10 to 20% of English-only students who aren't making the basic cut when it comes to the CST. So this is an issue for all students, but it's most pronounced for English learners. But this is also an opportunity to try to align the upcoming revision of the English language development standards with this new academic content standards from the Common Core. And there are other scholars, Linquanti and Hakuda, who have written about this extensively. So I will direct you all there for much more detail about that. But this is a right now pending opportunity for English learners. Another issue that's on the table and has been for a long time is linking funding to outcomes for these students. We know that it's going to cost more to educate English learners, but we don't really know how much. And we know it has to because the Supreme Court told us so. You know, we know providing the same academic content to someone who's an English learner and someone who's not an English learner does not count as providing the same education. So we need to do some thinking about how much is the right amount here. Then there are questions right now about, is the current funding that we even have on the table effective? Is it getting to the English learners in the districts and in the schools and the classrooms where they are? And if it is getting there, is it well spent? Another big issue that's been on the table for a long time, and I'm certainly not the first to bring it up, is does reclassification, does the funding structure create disincentives for reclassification? And if you're an English learner and you have dollars attached to you, and then when you're not an English learner and you don't, seems like that's a disincentive to reclassify. One way around this is to think about support for former English learners. You know, we saw some preliminary suggestion that they could maybe very well use some support. And if there's a transition where there is still some funding for these students later on, then perhaps there's not such a steep cliff for districts to do what makes sense for the student and move them to the reclassified designation. I know the governor's proposal earlier about the budget, about the weighted student formula, suggested that both poor students and English learner students would that you get extra funding for being either one of those two things. So if you're a poor English learner, once you're no longer an English learner, you're probably still poor. The district still gets the money and still is assisting you, and so that's one way around the really stark disincentive for reclassifying. So the potential new funding formulas are really an opportunity to possibly align spending more closely with outcomes, but there's plenty of work here to be done. So just to conclude and then hopefully get to some more questions, English learners are a very large part of our student population, a quarter. They're not going away. Even if we are reclassifying them, there are going to still be newcomers to this group. And we've had lots of success as evidenced by the performance of reclassified students. So it's not that it's complete, you know, misery and we have no good news. Of course, we've done really well by a lot of students who've been reclassified and are going on to college, but that's not the end of the story. There are many students who are still needing our help. And the policy considerations that are right now on the table that might really help are identifying the reclassification policies that produce the best outcomes for the most students, no small task, using the Common Core standards to more closely align English learner instruction to the academic course instruction that they need, and ensuring that any additional funding for English learners actually reaches them and does so effectively. So thank you for listening.